once you've got all of those levers and you've been able to look at how they can adjust and be moved to drive better value out of your business, then it's a matter of looking at how they all come together to provide that overall picture.
If you pull one and it's not working, but you could see as you look at it across, you know what, I've got a way I can increase my volume, I can increase my pricing or stop discounting, I can reduce my cost of goods and I can reduce my overheads. Well, that's kind of like happy days, isn't it?
If you want more time, money, freedom, and have a business that's not reliant on you, then you're in the right place. Each week, Mark Creedon, along with some of the very best business minds in the world, will take you through simple, practical steps you can take to create the business you always wanted. From his own practical experience, Mark will show you how to work less, make more, and get the business you always wanted, the one that you deserve. Now here's your host, one of Australia's most sought-after business coaches, Mark Creedon.
Welcome to the latest edition of the Mastermind for Business podcast. This podcast is for you if you are in business and feel like the business is like controlling you and it's kind of not doing what you hoped it would do when you first started it, right? So it's controlling you, it owns you, not you own it. And each week, in around about 20, 25 minutes, we give you some hints and tips on how you can be a lot more productive in your business, get some freedom back. And joining me in the chair is Adrian Waller. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you, Mark.
So Adrian is the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer of the Metropole Group, previously our commercial manager. And one of the things that I've got the greatest value from in having you here in the business, I mean, apart from your incredible good looks and wit, charm, sense of humor, is your ability to understand how numbers tell a story, right? So when we look at numbers, because you're a CPA,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
and lots of commercial experience as a CPA. But when we look at numbers, so you started presenting reports to me, but the thing I really loved about what you did is you came to me with a report, but you had the explanation. And I think that a lot of people listening to this now that run their business probably understand how to read a P&L, but I think they miss a lot of the story behind the numbers. Have you seen that a bit?
Yeah, I've seen that. And that's typical of non-accountants looking at profit and loss and working their way through looking at net profit and gross profit and thinking that's all they need to focus on.
Yeah.
For me, it's around scratching the surface of those numbers and looking at what is the underlying story of what the business is telling them through those reports.
Because if a picture tells 1,000 words, I think numbers tell probably 10,000 words, really.
Exactly right.
And it's funny you say that. It's for people who are good at running a business and not necessarily accountants. I always find it a bit ironic because a lot of the accountants I've met are really great accountants but not good at running a business. And a lot of the business people I meet are really good at running a business but not very good at accounting. So this is where I think you have the ability to kind of marry the two. Let's talk about, what are the main things that you think that people can look for in looking for the story behind the numbers? Because, you often, I'm going to say bang on about, but I want to say that politely and respectfully. Yes. But there's one thing that when we're talking about the performance of the Metropole Group, you're always talking about this one point, and that's the point of volume.
Volumes.
Yeah.
Volumes.
Talk to me about volumes and, what impact that has in terms of the story behind numbers.
So you've got to look at, in terms of your profit and loss, the revenue is obviously one of your key generators there. And of that, there's a relationship for your revenue of volume times price.
Yep.
And so most businesses are able to hold firm on their pricing, and it comes down to volume as of what they can get through the front door, through their client base. And when you're looking at that P&L, that's really a good set of management reports. With a P&L, you'll have volume as your first line. And that's one of the key points to start with.
Yeah. And it's interesting because since you've been talking about that point with the various heads of department within the group, that's now become their focus. Whereas their focus in the past might have been, well, my gross profit's doing okay, or my gross profit and net profit percentage are actually okay. But we had to go, hang on, no, this is about volume. If you really want to drive all those other numbers, to me, when you talk about volume, to me, it's like the first domino.
Mm.
Yeah?
So exactly.
All of the other dominoes will fall over if you get the volumes right.
Yes.
And the good part about that is it gives you one thing to focus on. So, if you've got small business owners listening now and they're sort of going, there's so much from accounting, I've got to focus on revenue, and we'll talk about all these other things, and COGS and overheads and gross profit and net profit. If you just focus on volume, the others, you've got to be aware of them. They'll kind of take care of themselves to a degree, won't they?
That's right. Volumes is your key ingredient to managing the business, managing that P&L.
Yep. And if you're looking at the volume numbers, because when you look at the results of volumes, it'll give you both the good news and the bad news, won't it?
Yeah, it does. And it's a matter of looking at a good P&L will have a target or a budget. And as you work through it on a monthly, quarterly basis, you look at what your actual volumes are compared to your budget or your target. And then you start to drill down into that. And if you're below budget or above budget, work out what's happened to produce those higher or lower volumes, and then identifying those good factors that you can then reinforce going forward, or alternatively, look at remedial action that needs to be put into place.
So let's talk about kind of remedial action. I mean, certainly in terms of volumes, remedial action might be generating more leads into the business, obviously, or increasing conversion rates on leads to sales, etc. But let's say that we've got a volume that's not performing quite as well as we'd like it to, and we've tried that remedial action and it doesn't work. Then there's still, it's again in those dominoes, it's the first domino, but there's a second, a third, and a fourth, and a fifth domino that we can look at, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. But again, it's trying to find the right process that will give you those volumes that you're looking for.
Yep. So let's say that, and I know all these other factors we're about to talk about of equal importance, but let's just say we've got volumes and they're not quite doing what we'd like them to do. We could then look at revenue, couldn't we?
Yeah, you can look at revenue, and then as part of that, it's then you've got to remember that revenue ultimately is made up of volume times price. Correct. So if you're not hitting those volume targets, then you look at your pricing to be able to maintain the revenue. And we see that across various businesses where if volume's down, well, to meet those revenue targets, we look at how can we get stronger pricing to support the business.
Yep. So that's the advantage. I mean, if in a perfect world, if you can get volumes right at the right price, that again, that's that first domino and everything should run quite sweetly from there. But if you're not achieving the volumes that you want to achieve, the opportunity then rests for you to go, okay, what's the next layer? And the next layer is revenue, because revenue is volume times price, as you say. So now I can look, maybe my pricing structure isn't right.
Yes.
If I can't ram home more volume, maybe I can ram home more price.
Yep. And I think it's important for business managers to understand that there are levers through the business that they can pull. So if volume is a lever that they can't pull on, then what's the next one is revenue.
Yes, I really like that idea. I like that idea of, levers to pull. If you imagine that you've got a business, and for any millennials listening to this, levers they'll be probably looking for something on a touch screen rather than a lever.
Yes.
Right? The button to push. But the lever is kind of the next thing. The next thing you need to adjust, like a dial, really.
Yes.
What do you need to dial up or down? So if you've dialed your volume up to maximum and you can't get any more, and your bottom line isn't doing what you need it to do, then you can move to the next dial or the next lever and go, all right, what can I do about pricing?
Yes.
Okay. So if volume's up, revenue's down, then we've probably got a pricing issue.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Cool. Nice and simple.
And there's a whole range of reasons why that may be as well. And it may even be discounting that's being done across the business that you look at and you say, is that necessary or can we do a better job on that?
Yep. It's interesting that you say that, and we spoke about this in preparation for this episode, but that was something that I hadn't sort of first turned to when I first think about pricing. I'm going, right, we'll need to increase prices. But in fact, when you look at it, it may not be that you need to increase. It might be that you're giving too much away, or that you're giving too much away at a discounted price.
Yes.
And, the thing about discounting, I always talk about the fact that rather than discounting, I'd rather value add. And there was some research done many, many years ago where they actually showed, and I forget where it was from, somewhere out of the States, but they actually gave people this option where they gave them a discount and they gave them a value add. And on physical calculation, the discount was worth more, and the majority of people chose the value add.
Right.
Because they felt like they were getting more.
Yes.
Right? They felt there was more with them in that. Right. So we've got volumes being the master stroke or the first domino. Then the next lever is revenue. I suppose once you've moved that, then you look to cost of goods. What is cost of goods?
Cost of goods sold, normally variable costs that are incurred to produce whatever product and service you're selling.
Yep.
So typically on a P&L, you'll see them as a percentage of your revenue. Now, the idea is that because they're variable, the more or the less that you produce, that percentage that COGS make up for your revenue should remain constant. Okay. And so if you've got a budget or a target in place, you know what percentage COGS of revenue you should have.
Yes.
So as you work through it on a monthly, quarterly basis, if your percentage of COGS, if your COGS as a percentage of revenue is different to what you'd expect, then you need to drill down and understand what's happening there.
So the good thing about that is you can then focus on that percentage as being a marker, if you like.
Yes.
So let's talk about COGS, because I understand COGS if I'm selling cakes, right? I then know my COGS, the cost to actually make that cake. So the eggs, the butter, the milk, the flour, or whatever it might be. What if I'm offering a service?
Yep. Then you go through and you look at how typically your labor costs that are directly involved with providing that service.
Right. Okay. Because I think sometimes when we look at service business, it's a little bit harder to think of the concept of COGS, cost of goods sold.
Yes.
When you think, well, I don't actually produce any goods, I just produce a service. But even services have a cost of goods sold.
Exactly. And even if it's just direct labor in providing that service, that's essentially what becomes your COGS.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right. So we've got 3 levers so far. We've got volume, we've got revenue, then we've got COGS.
Yes.
What's next?
Is really the other one then is overheads. Overheads are typically more your fixed costs that are incurred in operating that business. You know, that you're still paying those costs regardless of whether you're selling 1 unit or 1,000 units.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, some of those fixed costs may vary a little bit during the course of the month, and electricity is a good one where you may pay $1,000 a month on average for electricity. It might go up by $100 or less by $100 depending on what season you're in.
Yep.
But most of those costs are fixed.
I remember many years ago when I was doing sort of one-on-one consulting work, and I was approached by somebody, and I don't work in retail and I don't work in hospitality, but I was approached by somebody, friend of a friend, had a cafe. And they said, look, you know, I've got a real problem with my overheads, but I'm in a great location. The rent's really high, but I just can't make this work. And so I said, well, okay, let's look at overheads. You're paying your rent no matter what you do, and you're open from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. and 5 days a week. So how do we generate revenue in that business, in those business premises, when you're not there? Because those fixed overheads don't change.
Yes.
And they actually struck a deal with somebody else who would come in and run a bar in that cafe from 4 p.m. till 8 o'clock, 3 days a week, and they just paid them a rent, like an amount of like a lease contribution. So suddenly their overheads dropped quite dramatically, and the coffee shop they were running suddenly turned profitable.
Yep. And it's around investigating those fixed costs and look at how you can better manage them.
Yeah. So again, that's a good example of pulling levers. It always amazes me that around the corner from my house, there used to be this little shop, and it was a great little shop, and they sold, like you, I mean, I do drink a bit of coffee, but I really love my tea. Right? You're a tea lover, right? So I love my tea. I love going into tea too. What I used to love is pre-COVID, they used to have all the samples. You go around, you're tasting all the different teas in tea. I used to love that. But there was this little tea shop around the corner from me, and I'm sort of in the birds, and it was a lovely little shop to go into, but they were only open Friday afternoon, Saturday and Sunday morning.
Right.
I remember speaking to the owner and said, you know, you're only here. She goes, oh, yes, it's a bit of a side hustle, and I've got a job and I work. And I sort of looked and I thought, wow, but you're paying your rent 7 days a week.
Yes.
To work essentially 2 days a week. By the way, it's gone. Probably no surprise. Right. Yeah. And I sort of looked at that and thought, wow, you know, wouldn't it be great if you could find a way to reduce those overheads by either putting somebody in there on a commission basis, or maybe somebody's, you know, them having a product that they wanted to really sell in there as well. So, well, you can sell your product, you can stock the product for free if you work a day. Amazing, isn't it? You know, you can just look at the overheads. So, but I guess the thing with overheads is they're generally fixed. So you can't, it's not that you can generally vary those. You've just got to be more creative with them, haven't you?
Yeah. And particularly on a review perspective, it's good if you can get a P&L on a monthly basis over a period of, say, 6 to 12 months. And during your review, have a look at to see how constant they are month on month. Right. And when you see a variation occur, you know that there's something unusual occurred within that month. That requires further investigation. And again, that drill down helps tell the story.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I've ever looked at P&Ls in any business I've been involved in, the very first thing I do is I scan the P&L and I look for abnormalities. Yeah. And I would look like if it's a month-on-month comparison and something was $5,000 last month and it's $9,000 this month, I go, oh, and I usually just circle that. I go, I'll come back and ask the COO or the CFO or whatever about that. Yes. What's going on there? Yeah. Because things like, so overheads would be things like electricity, rent, wages. Mm. Yep. What else would fall into overheads?
Everything from fixed advertising, if you've got those sort of dealers.
Vehicle costs.
Bank fees, motor vehicle costs. Yeah.
So they should remain constant. And so you may not be able to reduce them, but you might be able to.
Yeah. And it's a matter of looking at those fixed costs as of how they relate back ultimately to the delivery of your products and services. And if they're not providing sufficient value, looking at how you can reduce those fees or those costs, or even then market test them as well to sort of say, is there a better deal out there for me in terms of those fixed costs?
Yeah. So you've actually just gone through that process with the Metropole Group with some of our fixed costs around banking, for example.
Yes.
And you'll be able to go, well, you know what, we're paying this amount of money. That's way too much money. Let's go talk to another bank and see what they'll do for us.
Yes.
And the reality is, if you've got a reasonably healthy business, that's kind of relatively easy one, isn't it?
It is. It adds value to your bottom line without necessarily going back to your client base and saying, look, we need to raise pricing or we need to do more around our volumes. It's a way of controlling your own outcome.
And by all means, we're not giving any specific financial advice or anything here, obviously, but have you found that banks are quite open to those conversations? If you've got a healthy business, are they looking for business?
Yeah, they are. Look, it's a competitive market.
Yeah.
So the business banking services change almost on an annual basis as of which bank is leading in that race. And so they're constantly trying to outdo themselves and constantly trying to win new work. So again, we're not providing any financial advice, but it's one of those things, and it applies across all product categories. You should really be looking at market testing them every sort of 2 to 3 years.
And I think that's true of most service provisions. I mean, I don't want to suddenly people start reviewing relationships with accountants and lawyers and bankers and things like that. But I think that there's an element of just reviewing the value you're getting from those services. And I'm happy to pay more if I'm getting great service, by the way.
Yes.
Right. So it's not always about the cost, because you and I have seen certainly circumstances where you've got something at a super cheap cost and it actually costs you more in the long run.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's counterproductive.
Yeah. It's all about getting better value out of that money.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, so when we look at a P&L, we look at numbers, there's kind of those 4 factors we've spoken about so far, but there's kind of an overall picture too, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, in terms of then once you've got all of those levers and you've been able to look at how they can adjust and be moved to drive better value out of your business, then it's a matter of looking at how they all come together to provide that overall picture. And that overall picture is your net profitability.
Yeah. And with those 4 levers, so we spoke about volume, revenue, cost of goods sold, and overheads, you could pull any one of those levers, or like if you were really brave, all 4.
Yes. Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
If you pull one and it's not working, but you could see as you look at a cost, you know what, I've got a way I can increase my volume, I can increase my pricing or stop discounting, I can reduce my cost of goods, and I can reduce my overheads. Well, that's kind of like happy days, isn't it?
And different circumstances will require a different combination of those levers. But business owners need to remember that they've got those 4 levers that are ultimately applicable through their P&L as of how they can drive better results going forward.
Yeah. And do you know, I think one of the biggest changes for me in business over the last, say, 10, 15 years is having an accountant, and if there's any accountants listening to this, perhaps you should listen to this, having an accountant that not just understands the story behind the numbers, but actually helps me to understand the story behind the numbers. So if you're listening to this right now and you go, this is all great, but I don't really get how I can do any of this, you really need to have an accountant. Your accountant shouldn't just be doing your tax return. Because honestly, you can go to somebody in the shopping center or do your tax return for you.
Yes.
But your accountant really should be helping you go, let's look at these levers and what can we pull, and helping you to guide you through that process.
Yep. And it's around finding that accountant with commercial experience that can look beyond the numbers and understand exactly what's happening in the business and aid the owner in driving better results.
Yeah. 100%. Oh, that's exactly what you've done for us. So, yeah, fantastic. Thank you. I've got 2 more questions for you. Is this the first podcast you've been on?
Yes. Quite nervous as my
Were you nervous?
Yes.
You've done amazingly well. These are the sort of things that we teach our clients all the time in our Mastermind for Business program. So, metropolemastermind.com.au. If you have enjoyed what you've heard today and you think you've got some great value out of it, please like us. If you know someone, family, friends, or in business that's just controlling them and you think, wow, they could really work on some of these levers, share this podcast with them. It's the sort of things we do all the time. Adrian, thank you. Great to have you here. Until we chat next in the next episode of the Mastermind for Business podcast, please make sure you spend time with those who matter most.